All right, I think we're about ready to go. Greetings, welcome everyone to our webinar. Today in our webinar, we're going to talk about 5 key things that you can do as a parent to improve your child's ACT test score. Now, my name is Rob Tracy, and I'll be presenting today. I'm the lead instructor here at actbrainy.com, and I've been teaching and training high school students for standardized exams for a very long time, since about 1996. Now, our goal here today is to share what I've learned about the ACT test with you so that you can help your children score as high as possible when they take the exam. Specifically, we're going to talk about what you need to do about 2 years before your child takes the ACT. Then we're going to look at things you ought to do about 2 months before they take the ACT. We'll then look at some things you need to do about a week before they take the ACT. We'll then look at things they need to do the very day before they take the ACT, and then we'll end our webinar today talking about things that they need to do the day of the ACT. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a couple of key notes when we'll talk about some housekeeping items that you need to be aware of before we get going. First of all, I want you to understand that this is an interactive seminar. I want you to ask questions. If you have a question while we're presenting, please feel free to stop me. Send whatever questions you have to this email address, help.actbrainy.com, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Also, I want you to stay tuned for a special offer at the end of this seminar. I've seen what the offer is, and you're going to want to see it if you've got a child taking the ACT pretty soon. Okay, with that out of the way, let's now spend some time talking about the ACT itself. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is, frankly, how incredibly important the ACT test is. Now, like it or not, the ACT is probably one of the most important tests your kid will ever take because it has a huge impact on their college choices and whether or not they're going to get a scholarship. And to be blunt, if your kid scores well on the ACT, then life is actually pretty good. And this is because most colleges and universities will use your child's ACT test score along with their high school GPA to determine whether or not they're going to be eligible for admission and whether or not they're going to get a scholarship. And believe me, a high ACT score can really help improve their chances, especially if they're like my kids and senioritis sets in a little early and their GPA reflects it. In fact, if their ACT score is high enough, they can be awarded a scholarship even with a, well, lackluster GPA. Let's take a look here. What you see here is a scholarship matrix from a local university where some of my children attend. And over in this column right here, you can see our ACT composite score. And over here, you can see various unweighted GPAs ranging from 4.0 down to 3.1. Now, here's what commonly happens. A lot of parents assume that because my child is sitting over here at about, say, a 3.4 GPA, then there is no way they're going to get a scholarship. Well, take a look at this matrix and you'll see that that actually isn't true. With a 3.4 GPA, your child can still get a really good scholarship. Notice over here that this scholarship is for 60% resident tuition. Over half, over 50% of their tuition can be paid for if they get a reasonable ACT score. So let's assume your child has an ACT score of a 3.4. If we come down here, we can see that if they get around a 33 on the ACT, which is not impossible. It's difficult, but not impossible. Well, guess what? They can still get this 60% resident tuition scholarship. That's not bad. This is entirely doable. Furthermore, let's say that your child has a little bit better GPA, maybe a 3.7 this time. Once again, a good ACT score, but you might be, excuse me, a good GPA, but you might be thinking, well, with this GPA, I don't know if they're going to be able to get a scholarship. Well, guess what? With a 30 ACT score, you still can get a 60% scholarship at this particular university. That's not bad. That's 60% of the tuition that you as a parent do not have to pay. So as you can see, spending a little bit of time and a little bit of money to prepare for the ACT can result in a rather huge return on investment. For example, let's suppose you invest maybe $150 on an ACT test prep course, and your child invests a few hours each week studying for that course. And as a result, they get that 60% tuition scholarship we just looked at. Well, this scholarship at this particular university is worth between $2,500 to $3,000 a year for 2 years. Well, guess what? If they get that scholarship for 2 years at the lowest amount, $2,500, then that $150 investment just returned $5,000. Not bad. And furthermore, if they keep their grades up while they're in college, which can be challenging for freshmen, but it can be done, then this scholarship can actually be renewed for another 2 years. The ROI then skyrockets up to $10,000 on a little bit of money invested up front and a little bit of study time invested up front. We're talking about $150 turning into $10,000. That is not bad. So now that we've discussed how important a good ACT score is, let's talk about how you get that ACT score up. Let's begin by talking about some things you need to do a couple of years before your child takes the ACT. All right, 2 years out, probably one of the most important things you need to do is make sure that your child is enrolled in academically challenging courses while they're in high school. I went through high school myself. My kids have been through high school. I know that the temptation is to take the easiest classes you can, right? Well, that's not the best strategy for when you're getting ready for the ACT. You need to be academically challenged before you take that test, because no amount of tips, no amount of tricks, no amount of strategy will overcome a lack of academic preparation when you take the ACT. Let's take a look at some things that you can do. First of all, your child needs to have a high degree of English and reading proficiency, because there are 2 tests on the ACT, English and reading comprehension, and you've got to know your stuff to do well. So when you go to take your ACT test, your child needs to be proficient with literature and with English grammar. Here are the key skills that they need over here on the right-hand side of the screen. First of all, they need to be able to read and analyze a passage. This is primarily for the reading test right here. And on the ACT reading test, they're going to be presented with several passages, some of them fiction, some of them nonfiction. And they need to be able to read that passage very quickly and then analyze several key things. For example, who is the audience for this passage? Who was the author writing to? What is the author's main argument? What point are they trying to get across? And then analyze the supporting facts and the conclusions that the author draws. A great way to be able to learn these skills is to take literature class in high school. A lot of kids hate going to literature class, but I'll tell you what, it helps a lot when you take your ACT test. In fact, the passages that your kid's going to read on the ACT will be similar to what they may read in a high school literature class. There'll be excerpts from a much larger passage, and they'll have to read it and analyze it for these main points right here and answer questions about it. In addition, we also have to be familiar with English grammar. This is hard for a lot of people because most people hate English grammar. Well, it's on the ACT test. Now, it'll be structured in a similar way to the reading test on the ACT, in that you'll have several passages that you have to read. But instead of looking for things like audience, main argument, supporting facts, and conclusions, you will instead have to pick out all the grammatical errors that have been deliberately introduced into that passage. And there are tons of different grammatical errors that are introduced. For example, you'll see things such as misuse of there versus there versus there. You'll see misuses of its versus its. You'll see pronoun agreement errors. You'll see verb agreement errors. You'll see problems with parallel sentence structures. The list goes on. There's about 40 different types of grammatical errors that are commonly seen on the English ACT test. Your child needs to be able to recognize those very quickly and know how to correct them. In addition to reading and English, there's also a dreaded test on the ACT that everybody hates, and it's frankly the one that everyone does the most poorly on, and that is the math test. Okay, I'm going to give you a little hint about how hard this math test is. The average student who takes the ACT only gets about half of the questions on the ACT math test right. That's not very many. That means most kids get half of the questions wrong. It is quite hard. So before you take the ACT test, it's really important that your student enroll in the necessary coursework, because you can't cram for this type of material. They should have taken Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry at a minimum. These three classes right here. Now, in the old days, these are the titles we used for these courses. If your high school is now using a Common Core curriculum, these titles might be slightly different. So you might have to actually talk to your counselor or some of the math teachers at the high school to make sure that your child is enrolled in the right courses. But they need to have all of these. They need to be able to, they need to have a good understanding of Algebra 1 and a really good understanding of Algebra 2 and Geometry. These are tested very heavily on the ACT math test. Now, in addition, you will see on the ACT math test about 4 trigonometry questions. Now, this trigonometry component of the math test really freaks a lot of students out because, face it, trig isn't easy. It's rather difficult. And so when they find out that there's trig on the ACT math test, they tend to go limp. I can't handle this. This is too hard. If they've taken trig, great. They'll be well prepared for the ACT test. But guess what? If they haven't taken trig, don't panic, because as I pointed out over here, of the 60 questions on the ACT, only about 4, maybe a maximum of 5 of those questions cover trig. That means you can actually score extremely well on the ACT math test without having taken trig. Now, if you want a perfect score, yes, you're going to have to take trig. But if you're looking for a really good score, trig is actually kind of optional. As long as you do well with these first 3 topics, you can score very high on the ACT. Now, remember, just a second ago, I said that the average student misses about half of the questions on the ACT math test. Remember, there's 60 questions on the ACT math test. That means they're missing about 30 of them on average. Therefore, you can focus your efforts, if your child is struggling with trig, focus your efforts on algebra, algebra 2, and geometry, and they'll actually be just fine because they can miss these 4 trig questions and still get a pretty decent score. In fact, if they got all of these questions right and then missed just these 4 trig questions, then they would probably be in the top 99% in the nation. Okay, so the point I'm trying to get across is don't get really wigged out about the trigonometry part of the ACT math test. If you focus right here and then study this if necessary, if you really want that higher score, that's great. If you don't have trig or a solid understanding of trig, take the test anyway. You can still do really well. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the key skills and knowledge you need for the math test. You need to have an understanding of intervals and sequences, exponents and roots, proportions and ratios, matrices, basic statistics. Now, this one is really important. There are a lot of stats questions on the last couple of ACT tests that I have seen, especially in the field of probability. So if you want to do well on the ACT, make sure your child knows how to do probability questions. Also, matrices. This is something that they usually cover very lightly in math class, and they're really confusing, frankly. Yet there are usually 1 or 2 questions on matrices on the ACT math test. And everybody hits them and no one can remember how to do them because they did them back in the 9th grade and it's been 3 years and they don't remember how to do it. So make sure you understand how to do matrices. Also, ratios right here, absolutely critical. There are many ACT math test questions that can actually be solved by setting up the story problem into a simple ratio. When you read the text of the problem, you're scratching your head going, oh my goodness, I have no idea how to solve this problem. However, many of those questions can actually be formatted into a simple ratio. You solve for X, and there's your answer to the problem. So a really complex looking math test question can actually end up being just a very simple ratio question. Also, be sure that they are familiar with systems of equations. Systems of equations are problems where you have two variables, X and Y, and you got to figure out what both X and Y equal. They're a little more difficult. They also need to know how to factor polynomials. They need to be very familiar with functions and also working with inequalities and quadratic equations. Coordinate geometry, this one is huge. There's lots of coordinate geometry questions on the ACT math test. Also, shape geometry. When I'm talking about shape geometry, I'm talking about triangles, circles, squares, rectangles, various types of shapes, and being able to calculate their area, their volume, their circumference, and so on. And by the way, for our shape geometry, probably one of the most important formulas that your child can remember for the ACT test is a very simple one. The Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Memorize this because you can use it to solve a lot of the problems on the math test. In the course that I teach, I show how you can use this simple formula right here to solve problems that don't at first appear to involve a triangle, but they can be converted to use a basic triangle, and then this formula right here can be implemented to solve them. Would their math teacher approve? Absolutely not. Do we care? Absolutely not. The only thing we care about on the ACT is getting the right answer. We do not care how we got to that answer. And finally, we do have our trigonometry questions. Like I said, there are about 4 or 5 max on the test. They should understand the basic concepts of sine, cosine, and tangent. Now, they may encounter other things such as secant and cotangent, although very, very few questions on the ACT test will cover those. Only one here and there. Sometimes an entire test will not have anything on secant, cosecant, and cotangent. They will focus very heavily on sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay, so that's the math test. Now let's spend a minute looking at the science test. Now, the science test is really interesting because it's basically a reading comprehension test, just like we looked at earlier with the reading test a couple of slides ago. There's not a lot of difference between the two. And here's why I tell you this. A lot of kids really freak out when they find out that there's a science test on the ACT because they're not good at science. They don't like science. And I always tell them, you know what? You don't have to be good at science to do well on the ACT science test. What you do need to be good at is reading and understanding what a passage says. You don't actually have to understand the science involved in the passage on the science test. You just need to understand how to find different data points in the passage on the science test. Now, to get yourself ready for the science test, you really should have about 2 years of science in high school before you take the test. Here's a list of possible topics: astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology, meteorology, physics, and so on. Now, you do not have to take all of these courses. 1 or 2 will suffice. The reason why is that in these courses, you learn the basics of science, such as the scientific method, how experiments are conducted, how experimental results are evaluated, and things like that. You don't actually have to know anything about astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology, or meteorology, or physics to do well on the science test. This shocks a lot of people because they assume that I've got to know all of my animal kingdom phylums from biology and how to balance a chemical equation from chemistry, or how to identify the age of a rock strata from geology, and so on. Guess what? You don't have to know these things. This is the most important thing you can remember about the science test, is the fact that it does not actually test conceptual topics from these fields of study. What you will be tested on is your ability to read and then analyze a scientific passage and then interpret the data in that passage, which means you don't have to understand a single thing that was talked about in that passage. You just need to be able to find the information that's being requested. For example, you might be asked to identify a particular value from a chart or graph. You may read a passage that has several different charts in it. Question may say, what was the atmospheric pressure on Tuesday? Let's close our virus protection window right here. And so you have to go find out what the atmospheric pressure was on Tuesday. You may also be asked to identify trends in the data in the passage. You may be asked, well, was the atmospheric pressure trending up or down over this 30-day period? You have to be able to look at a graph and decide whether that trend was going which way or the other. You may also be asked to make inferences from the information in the passage. This is a little bit harder. These are really pretty easy questions here, because as long as you can read the passage, look at a chart, and pull data from the chart, you can answer these questions very easily. The inference questions, on the other hand, are a little bit more difficult because they require you to look at the data and then draw a conclusion from it that isn't explicitly written in the passage itself, but it can still be done. I always tell students that the answer to all of the science test questions are in the passage itself. You just have to know how to find them. And you may also be asked to analyze the research methods used in the passage. How was the experiment set up? What variables were tested? What were the results? What might have changed the results in the experiment? And then finally, you may be asked to compare and contrast different opinions from several different scientists. They'll present a particular topic of discussion in the passage, and then scientist A will present their opinion, scientist B will present their opinion, and you just have to be able to identify the differences between them. Okay, with this in mind, let's now talk about some things that you need to do 2 months before the ACT. So we've taken all of our coursework, we've gotten all that academic knowledge stuffed inside our heads. Now we're getting close to the time of actually we're going to take the ACT. Here is what I recommend you do. The very first step is to actually take the ACT once ice cold. When I say ice cold, I mean don't study at all. Just go take it. Why? Because we need to find out where the child is weak in the topics covered on the ACT. So don't even try. Go in and just take it and see what the results are. The ACT organization will send you a score report, and you can also request a copy of the actual ACT test that they took. And so you can see what the questions were, and then you can see what the correct answers were and find out what your child answered, and then find out where your gaps in knowledge are. This is extremely valuable. This analysis will then allow you to make a list of subject and topics that you need to focus on, because frankly, trying to cram for the entire ACT is kind of like trying to cram 4 years of high school into 2 months, and you can't do it. What you need to do is study strategically by identifying exactly what needs to be studied and then focusing on just those topics. Okay, so about 2 months before you take the ACT for real, go in and take it cold, find out where your weaknesses are, and then make a list of study topics. And once you have made that list of study topics, you need to study, 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 and study some more. And I strongly recommend that you invest in a test prep course. The reason I recommend this is because ACT tutors like me make our livelihood by analyzing endlessly the ACT tests. So we know exactly how to help your student succeed well in the ACT. We understand how the questions are written. We understand how they're formatted. We understand the strategy that's used behind the answers that are presented on the test. So we can help your student much more effectively than if they just opened up a book about, say, trigonometry. There's too much information there. You need to focus strategically. Investing in a test prep course can help you do that. So invest some time and money in a test prep course, and then take as many practice tests as you possibly can. This is absolutely critical, because studying is only half of the problem. The other problem is learning how to take the test itself. The ACT test is very structured and it has a very specific set of rules. You've got to know what those rules are to do well. And you're not going to learn those rules unless you've actually taken the test. Now, here's one key thing that I want you to be aware of, and that's the fact that the ACT is a timed test. The first couple of times you take a practice test, don't worry about the timing at all. Just take it, learn it, and do the best you can on your practice test. After you've done that a couple of times, then start imposing the time limits for each exam. They're listed at the very beginning of each subject test. Like the English test says it takes X many minutes. The science test takes X many minutes. Set that timer, because I found many times that students can do extremely well on the ACT as long as they have many, many hours to do it in. That's not good enough, because on the ACT, you will not have many, many hours. You'll have a very set specific amount of time, certain number of minutes that you have to complete the test in. So when you're practicing, you need to constrain yourself to that number of minutes to make sure that when you go take the real test, you can accomplish that, okay? So here's a suggested study pattern that you can use. During this 2-month period before you take the real ACT, after you've taken the ACT once cold, on Monday through Friday, study for about 2 hours each day. Then on Saturday, take a full practice test. And this will take some time, about 3 hours. Now, when I say this, a lot of people freak out. Students freak out. I already have band, and I have basketball, and I have this, and I have homework. I can't study for 2 hours a day. Well, you know what? You just have to make it a priority, because this right here will pay off big time when you go to apply for scholarships, which we talked about at the beginning of this webinar. It's worth the investment. And a lot of folks don't like taking 3 hours on every Saturday to take a practice test. Once again, it is worth the effort. You'll be rewarded later on with admission to a good school and possibly a scholarship as well. Okay, so I need to load a new set of slides here. Hang on just 1 second. Okay. So we're down to what you need to do about a week before the ACT. This is where things get really intense. Here's what I recommend. Take 2 full practice tests, one on Monday and one on Wednesday, because remember, the ACT is only administered on Saturdays. So on Monday, take a full practice test in the evening after school and after practice and after everything, and then do it again on Wednesday. Again, we want to identify where the weak spots still exist. And then we want to focus on those weak topics on Tuesday and on Thursday, okay? So we're really cramming it on this last week before the ACT. And then I also recommend that you bank up on sleep. The idea here is that if you are tired when you take the ACT, you're not going to do well. And just sleeping the night before sometimes isn't enough. You know that teenagers' lives are very hectic. They're doing lots of things. And a lot of times they're functioning on about 3 hours of sleep a night. That is a recipe for disaster on the ACT. They need to bank up on their sleep. So the entire week before, make sure that they're getting about 8 to 10 hours, if possible. It will really help when Saturday comes. Now let's take a look at what you do the day before the ACT. I actually recommend that on Friday before you take the test, just relax, don't practice. Why? Because the tension level tends to get high right before the test, and that can cause you to not sleep the night before, and that will make you perform very poorly on the ACT Saturday morning. So on Friday, if you've prepared properly, don't cram, just take it easy, go do something fun, so that you can rest the night before. And I also recommend that you eat a lot of carbohydrates, because your brain requires a lot of energy to process, to run. You need to give it the fuel that it needs to function on the day of the ACT. So go ahead and eat a lot of carb-rich foods. And then before you go to the day before you go to take the ACT, get everything ready so you're not in a panicked rush Saturday morning trying to get out the door. We need to have your calculator ready to go. And by the way, before you take your calculator, go to the ACT website. It's act.org. And make sure that your make and model is approved, because if your make and model is not on the approved calculator list, they won't let you take it into the testing center. And not having a calculator on the ACT will torpedo you, because you will not have enough time to make calculations manually. Also, you need to bring multiple number 2 pencils. Don't get number 3s, get number 2s. We need to have a good soft lead pencil that makes a really dark mark. And I would say take many of them, like 2 to 3 of these. One of my favorite quotes goes something like this: 1 is none, 2 is 1, which means that if I have 1 pencil going into the ACT and it breaks, malfunctions, gets lost or whatever, I don't have any pencils. If I take 2 or 3 and I lose 1 or break 1 or whatever, I still have 1 or 2 more that I can use. Also, please be aware that you must take in your identification with you. You need to have a state-issued hard plastic ID card. It needs to be your driver's license. A student ID will work. Don't take anything else because they won't allow it. Also, make sure you have your admission ticket ready. You printed this out when you originally signed up for the ACT test. And also make sure that the picture on your admission ticket right here actually looks like your picture on the ID. They're trying to prevent students from cheating by hiring people to go in and take the test for them. So they'll require you to take a picture when you sign up for the ACT, and then they'll compare that picture to your ID card when you go in to actually take the test. If the two don't look alike, you could be in trouble. And here's one I always recommend too. Have a map to the testing center. If you're not sure where it is, have a map printed out from Google Maps with directions if necessary. Because the last thing you need on Saturday morning when you're rushing to the test is to go, oh, I don't know where this test center is at. That would be bad. So make sure you have a map so you know where to go. And then finally, go to bed early. Don't stay up all night playing Call of Duty or something like that. It will torpedo you when you take the ACT test the next day. Get the adequate rest that you need for Saturday morning. So on the day of the ACT, here's what I recommend. First of all, get up early enough to get ready without being in a rush. The point here is that you want to reduce anxiety. We want to drop that anxiety level down. Drop down that anxiety, because anxiety is a killer on the ACT. It can cause your brain to lock up. If you're rushed and panicked because you woke up 15 minutes before you're supposed to be there, you're going to be anxious. So don't do that. Get up early enough to get ready to go. And then also eat a carb-loaded breakfast. As we talked about a minute ago, your brain needs a lot of energy to process and run. So give it the fuel that it needs. Eat a good, healthy, carb-loaded breakfast. And also, please be familiar with your testing center rules. This trips up a lot of students because they expect to be able to take their phone with them wherever they go. And if they are separated from it, it causes, again, great anxiety. Please be aware that most testing centers will not allow you to bring your phone in there. So be prepared for that eventuality. Also, please be aware that some testing centers have other rules, such as not allowing students to wear hats. I've seen that before. So just be familiar with what the rules are so that you're not surprised on the day of the test. And then when you're ready to go, leave early enough to account for various things such as traffic, finding a parking spot. Many times these tests are administered at universities, and finding a parking spot at that university is going to be difficult. And it's also possible you're going to have to walk a really long way to get from the parking lot to the testing center. This is another thing that trips up a lot of students. They don't realize the fact that if you are late for the ACT, they do not let you in, period. There is no forgiveness. So you need to be there on time. In fact, you should plan on being there about 10 minutes early to make sure that you don't get locked out. All right, so those are the key things you can do a couple of years before the ACT, a couple of months before the ACT, a couple of weeks before the ACT, the day before the ACT, and on the day of. If you follow these suggestions, it will really help improve your overall score on the ACT. Now, before we end our webinar today, I want to do two things. The first one is to make you aware that we will be having a 24-hour flash sale on all of our ACT test prep products. And if you look right here, this is a phenomenal sale. We don't do this very often. It'll be 40% off all of our test prep classes within the next 24 hours. Just go pick the course that you want and then enter coupon code, promo code FLASH at checkout, as you can see down here, and you will get this massive discount applied, but it does expire in 24 hours. So don't dawdle. So at this point, I want to make myself available to you to answer any questions you may have. If you have any questions, please send them to me at help.actbrainy.com, and I will get back to you and answer your question. Thank you for participating in our webinar today. It's been a good, enjoyable time. Once again, if you have questions, you can email me right here. And don't forget our 40% off flash sale. Thank you and have a wonderful day.